Well, welcome. Good afternoon to the 11Alive Facebook page. Here in the newsroom, we've been watching the many hours of the Robert Mueller testimony today up in Washington, D.C. Robert Mueller spent time between two House committees. First, he was before the Judiciary Committee this morning. Then he spent this afternoon in front of the Intelligence Committee. When he was in front of the Judiciary Committee, there was three members of the Georgia representation there. It was Doug Collins from the Gainesville area, Hank Johnson, and also Lucy McBath. We'll get to some of their testimony here in just a second, but we have Dr. Andra Gillespie joining us from Emory University, political science professor. Of course, needs no introduction, but Jeff Hellinger, evening anchor here at 11Alive. Those Georgia representatives, as you might guess, you saw their testimony, sort of fell along party lines there. Doug Collins was sort of getting at the heart of it. The answers are in the report. It's time to move on. That's what Republicans have been saying. For the Democrats, we'll have their testimony on air coming up at 5 o'clock. I'll give you a look at that. But Lucy McBath was really running down, I guess, the accomplishments of this report. Sort of, you know, for Democrats, it might not have got that impeachment proceeding that they want yet, but it did lead to a lot of convictions and prison time for some of Trump's closest allies during the campaign. And also, I guess, charges against Russians that are still standing. And then went through the testimony for Hank Johnson. He was really zeroing in on the role that Robert Mueller played here, that unique role of Trump saying that he wanted him out, and sort of that could have led to obstruction of justice if he would have taken that step, potentially. So those were sort of where Georgia was at. I know you all are going to take sort of the 30,000-foot view here, the bigger picture view. But that's what Georgia, their role today, they had a prominent role there. I think they were represented about as well as any other state, probably more represented. So I'm going to slide out, put that story together for our 5 and 6 o'clock news. Jeff, Andra, I'll leave it in your capable hands to give our viewers a look at today's testimony up there in D.C.
Thanks.
So here we are, Dr. Gillespie. What we knew yesterday, we know today. It did not move the needle either left or right, and then you've got the great in-between who may not have been paying attention, who might not understand it to begin with. And that's not necessarily being an insult of those who don't, you know, really have an opinion, but not everybody follows politics.
Right. I mean, so I think some people were hoping that this was going to be Watergate Part 2. And so people have heard in the historical narrative how the country was riveted by the Watergate hearings and how people turned in. And that may be true toward the end, you know, of the Watergate hearings. The media landscape is different, so I think to expect that the country would be riveted by the Mueller hearings in the same way that they would have been riveted by the Watergate hearings 45 years ago, when there wasn't cable television, and you know, where you didn't have so many choices in terms of media, I think was probably a little bit far-fetched. And so people needed to temper their expectations. And then I think part of the reason why this isn't good television is that, one, Robert Mueller didn't want to be there. He had already made that very, very clear. And then it turns out he's actually not that great on camera. And so, you know, so in terms of his answers,
he seemed frail at times.
Yes, you know, forgetful, inarticulate at various points, so he didn't have a commanding presence to talk about what was going on. That doesn't mean that there aren't sound bites that Democrats won't pull from this, and that doesn't mean that Democrats can't use this hearing to try to make the case that there are some serious character and ethical problems in the Trump campaign and in the Trump administration that need addressing as a result of it. The other thing that I think is really risky in this race was in the hearings today is the way that the Republicans, in some ways because they wanted to make the case of no collusion, may have also given the appearance that they were actually downplaying the role of Russian interference in the election. And so that may be something that may be something that, you know, they live to regret one day in their defense of the president. At the same time, it seems like they took a somewhat cavalier attitude towards the ways that Russia was infiltrating our election system.
I've heard a lot of comparisons to Watergate from 1973, and I think it's not a very good comparison on a number of levels. First of all, you had some very compelling personalities on the Watergate panel, thinking about Senator Sam Erwin, who was from North Carolina, who was, you know, kind of a country boy who sort of held court on Richard Nixon and Ehrlichman and John Dean and all of that, and it gave it a much different feel. These leaders at that time had distinct personalities, and they brought something to the hearings. It was very compelling to people, even those, again, who didn't follow politics at the time. This just seemed like it was business as usual. It seemed like everybody on the left was lining up, everybody on the right was lining up, and it is a very familiar kind of dictum that we have been hearing over the months and over the years.
Well, I think what you're tapping into is this idea that America is much more polarized now than it was in 1973 and 1974. And that polarized partisan lens is what people are actually viewing the Mueller report for. So I'd say today was a Rorschach test. And basically, you know, you saw in it what your partisan predispositions were going to lead you to see in the Mueller report and actually in Robert Mueller's testimony. And so for that reason, nothing has changed. So in terms of making the case for impeachment, if Democrats were hoping that Mueller was going to slip up and say something like, yes, you should impeach, or yes, the only reason I, didn't, recommend to prosecute the president was because of the OLC report, which he almost did, and then he took back. By the time he got to the second hearing, right, they weren't going to get that permission from Mueller that they needed to proceed. And so what that means is that, for people who oppose the president, they're going to have to fight this out on the electoral terrain. And this was actually probably what was going to happen because we are getting, within a year and a half of the presidential election. And so it would be really hard to proceed with impeachment the closer we get to the election.
If you have any questions for Dr. Gillespie and you would like them asked, go ahead and ask them on Facebook right now. And I think we have some questions coming up. If we can figure out if we're up and Adam, as the old line goes, we certainly will get to that as soon as we possibly can. So when you see that pop up on Facebook, if you would ask some questions, and we certainly will pass them along. I was reading an editorial from the New York Post, which is a Republican-leaning Rupert Murdoch publication, but their point essentially was this afternoon, that there's nothing to be had in this, nothing that we don't know that we didn't know before, and that Congressman Nadler was hoping for a lot more. It's not there. Now that certainly is the Republican tact through all of this, but it makes you think about, does this injure at all the Democrats and their ability to try and get into the White House in 2020 if they continue the impeachment process? Does that have any kind of residual anti or burn on them?
Well, I mean, I think if Democrats in the House in particular try to proceed with opening an impeachment investigation under the guise that they have more investigatory powers when there's an impeachment hearing. That's been a key argument of Democrats going forward. I think the question then becomes, does this start to look like a witch hunt? And that was the point that Republicans were trying to make today, was that there had been an investigation that took 2 years, that cost millions of dollars, that had lots of personnel involved, and they couldn't come up with a lot of conclusive findings. And so if those findings were conclusive, are you just continuing to go on a fishing expedition? And so then that actually allows the president to try to paint himself in a sympathetic light, to try to curry the favor and support of his voters. And so would it be better to just attack the president for saying his record of achievement is paltry, therefore we should vote against him, or you don't like the tone in which he's running government, or he's violating norms and those are undermining institutions? So there are lots of opportunities and strategies that Democrats could take. They just are going to have to decide which is the one that they're going to do.
Did you hear anything that surprised you today?
So, I think probably to go back to what Gerald Nadler's original intention was. His intention wasn't necessarily to unearth anything that was new for people who have been paying attention. But I think what he was hoping was that this hearing was going to be the Cliff Notes version. So for those who hadn't read the book, this would be the chance for them to watch the movie, so to speak. And people have used that book versus movie analogy in their discussion of what was going on. But in order for it to be a compelling movie, it would have to be interesting. And the fact that Mueller refused to answer a lot of questions, the fact that his delivery was halting, the fact that he hesitated a lot, I think you got the sense that he wasn't necessarily sure of the answers. And part of that was the nature of, you've written this massive document that's over 400 pages long, and it was written by committee. And so he didn't actually personally write all 448 pages of that report. And so he didn't actually look like he was always in command of all of the details. And that was something that actually I think ended up working to the detriment of the Democrats who were hoping for something explosive to come from this.
How about the Trump White House? What would the feeling be on 1600 Pennsylvania tonight? Would it be one of vindication or a sense of the wolves are not at the door, or if they are, we have a strong door in front of them?
Based on what I've heard from news reports, President Trump seems pretty happy.
Should he be?
Well, I mean, so he seems pretty happy because the Democrats didn't get the soundbite that they were quite hoping for. I think there are some soundbites that Democrats may have the opportunity to use going forward. but it's just a question of how they play their cards. And so I think probably it's hard about this, I talked about this on Twitter today, is that Democrats may want to make a character argument that even if the evidence doesn't rise to the level of recommending prosecution, whether or not you can prosecute the president while he's actually in office, there are some issues raised about ethics and character that are important. And so this is an issue area that Republicans have historically owned for the last few generations. But if you're making the argument that the party that's supposed to be of ethics and character and values isn't living up to their ideals, look at how this president is behaving. And even if there is an obstruction, why is there obstructive behavior that looks like there is an attempt to cover up something? Like, doesn't that suggest somebody who should not be in a position of leadership? If they take that route, I mean, I think it's risky, and I can't predict what the outcome would be with that. That might be an opportunity to go through. But I think, you know, if people kind of continued with impeachment right now, I would say without any hesitation, there aren't 67 votes in the Senate to remove him. So I think you have the same number of votes that you had like this morning at this point this afternoon. And so I don't think it strategically actually makes sense to continue to pursue impeachment.
One of the things about 1973 and Watergate was lies brought down Richard Nixon. And we heard so many lies today. In fact, I thought one of the most interesting takeaways that I had listening to Mueller was the fact that he had said basically it was hard to get the truth because there's so many lies out there. That in itself would seem to be an indictment of past generations, but clearly with this administration, that is something that seems to be the norm and seems to be accepted, of being deceitful, not answering questions as you are asked. Doesn't seem to have any ramifications, at least politically.
Yeah, I mean, so at this point, I think the American public has become inured to the fact that President Trump is accused of lying on a daily basis. I think the Washington Post has logged more than 10,000 lies that they have caught him saying. So this is, or, you know, that they're alleging that he's saying. And so the idea that the president isn't truthful is something that I think has already baked into the cake. So people already know that, and they have either decided that that reinforces their view to be skeptical of him, or that, you know, they've decided that they're still going to support him despite the fact that he has a very tenuous relationship with the truth.
So if you're running against Donald Trump and you're one of the 20 Democrats that are queuing up trying to win, does this empower you, or is it something that you continue the narrative and you move on to other ways to try and make inroads against this White House?
So I think the big question tonight is not whether or not any Republicans were moved. Republicans aren't moved from this. And for those strategic reasons, I would argue it doesn't make sense to continue with impeachment. But it will become a question about whether or not the group of 80 or so Democrats that actually do want to proceed with an impeachment investigation, whether or not they actually, that group grows, whether or not there are more people who are actually talking about impeachment. You know, toward the end of the Intelligence Committee briefing, Adam Schiff makes the case for why committees need to continue to investigate the executive branch, or why they need to continue to investigate the Trump administration. And so people may take that as their mandate, not necessarily to try to push impeachment, but to try to hold the president accountable under the guise that they perceive that he doesn't like to be held accountable for anything, and somebody has to do it.
You're a political scientist. I'm not. But as I sat there watching, I follow history closely, I kept thinking, American government is like an engine without a transmission right now. And I don't know how you change the system to try to get people certainly to go toward the greater good, which seems absolutely impossible at this point. And I think maybe that's most troubling of all, is the fact that government seems to get in the way of itself, and the trickle down to all of us is felt.
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of things to think about. I mean, I think lots of people who are studying American politics and American institutions realize that this is a crisis period where our institutions and our norms are at risk. And I think it becomes a question of what we do with those situations. And part of the reason why it's difficult to actually change institutions for the better, or actually make them work in a way that's even remotely close to what the framers intended for them to work, is that the politics of polarization, and in some ways the politics of personality, have gotten in the way. And so what it's going to take to change that is some people who are willing to perhaps give up a partisan advantage, are willing to perhaps stand up to their peers and say, you know what, I'm not necessarily worried about how gaming this for my side, but I'm actually willing to kind of speak truth to power and to stand up for what's right. And so we haven't seen that type of courageous leadership in a long while.
They can't get through the primaries.
And so, well, people think that they can't get through primaries, and in some cases that is in fact true. But what would happen if you actually had a critical mass of Republicans who stood up to the president and said, you know what, I understand that you control the party, but you can't control everybody, and there's certain things that are happening that are just unacceptable. Or what would happen if there were a group of Democrats who stood up and said, you know what, there are some proposals that are being put out here that I actually think are deleterious to the functioning of our country. So I understand that it's popular to the Twitterverse that doesn't represent all of the United States, much less all of the Democratic Party, but it's time to say that's wrong, and I'm not afraid of you labeling me sort of, you know, as not being with it or progressive enough to say that that actually just doesn't make sense and we don't want to do that. Yeah, there are going to be people who are going to lose their seats, and part of the courage is being willing to lose one seat over this. But sooner or later, somebody's got to cry out that the emperor has no clothes. So I'm still waiting for that courageous person who's willing to cry out, the emperor has no clothes, and is actually willing to put the good of the institution ahead of their own personal advancement.
As we wrap this up very quickly here, one of the more famous political commentators and journalists in the country told me that with Twitter, less than 1% of the American population, and it drives the bulk work of everything in American politics and journalism, and for that matter in American pop culture these days. And he says until that changes, we're all stuck.
Well, I mean, you know, I don't know the statistics about sort of usership, but what I do know is what a representative sample looks like. And the Twitterverse is a self-selected sample, so therefore we can't make any claims that is actually representative of the views of all Americans.
And polling has been anything but accurate over the last couple of years.
I think it's been more accurate than people have given it credit to be. I think that there are a lot of politicians who want to talk about, you know, and throw noise by saying that, you know, if it didn't actually predict an election results, you know, to the 10th of a percentage point,
but
it's
you
wrong.
Don't think it's as far off as the conventional wisdom holds?
No. Yeah, I mean, everything's been within the, not everything, but there have been lots of things that have been within the margin of error. I think that you have to understand, if you talk to 1,500 people, you're not going to get sort of an exact sort of perfect slice of everything that's going on. And people do lie and people do troll. And there are people who are doing work on that actually right now. But the question is, what does it look like within the margin of error? And so that number is the midpoint of a range of possible answers. And most of the time, lots of the polls are actually sort of falling within that range. It's just that we expect perfection off of something that was actually never intended to be perfect.
Dr. Andra Gillespie of Emory University, always so insightful.